What would you do if you walked into a restaurant, only to be denied a table? Not because they were full, but because they assumed you didn't belong. For Marcus Reed, a world-renowned chef, this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a moment that would change everything. But before we dive in, let me know, where are you watching from? The soft glow of city lights shimmered against the windows of a renowned restaurant nestled in the heart of downtown, a place where the elite dined, and every dish was served with precision and elegance. Outside, the evening air buzzed with activity as well-dressed patrons made their way inside, greeted by the sound of gentle jazz and the clinking of wine glasses. Among them was Marcus Reed, a tall, broad-shouldered black man, exuding quiet confidence in a tailored blazer. He stood for a moment, admiring the view of the lively street, before walking toward the restaurant doors. The cold brass handles felt smooth in Marcus's hand as he pulled the door open, stepping into the lavish interior. La Rivière, the restaurant, was famous for its opulence, a place where chefs were revered as artists and patrons prided themselves on knowing the difference between truffle varieties. Marcus smiled to himself, not for the first time appreciating how far his life had come. Tonight, though, was supposed to be simple, a quiet evening to savor good food, away from the noise and chaos of his usual days in professional kitchens. Marcus approached the hostess, a young woman with a polite but detached expression. Her name tag sparkled under the dim lighting. Isabel. She glanced up at him, her eyes shifting slightly as she took in his appearance. There was no recognition in her face, but there was something else. Her posture stiffened. The corners of her mouth twitched slightly, just enough to register judgment. "Good evening," Marcus said with a polite nod. "Reservation for Marcus Reed." Isabel's lips curved into a tight smile, the kind that looked practiced, not warm. She glanced down at the large leather-bound reservation book in front of her, flipping through the pages with deliberate slowness. "Just a moment," she murmured. Marcus kept his expression neutral, though he'd encountered this kind of subtle dismissal before. He'd grown accustomed to silent assumptions people made about him based on how he looked. Skin too dark for a place like this, stature too imposing to blend into its refined atmosphere. Isabel continued to scan the pages, furrowing her brow as if she were searching for a name that didn't belong. After a pause that stretched a little too long, she looked up and gave Marcus the kind of smile people reserve for misunderstandings. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't see a reservation under that name." Marcus shifted his weight, remaining calm. "That's odd. I made it a week ago. Could you double-check, please?" The hostess's polite veneer thinned just a little, her tone sharpening. "I've checked already, sir. We're fully booked tonight. Perhaps—" She hesitated, her voice laced with subtle condescension. "You could try one of the restaurants down the street. They're more casual." Marcus's jaw tensed, but only slightly. He wasn't new to this game. He knew the unspoken rules, the kind of assumptions people made when they saw a black man walk into a room filled with white tablecloths and crystal chandeliers. But tonight wasn't supposed to be a fight. He had hoped for a quiet dinner, no complications, no uncomfortable moments like this. He took a breath, steadying himself. "I understand you're busy," Marcus said evenly, "but I'd appreciate it if you could check again. I called and confirmed the reservation myself." Isabel's smile tightened. There was no reason for her to doubt him. He was dressed impeccably, carrying himself with the ease of someone who knew his way around fine dining. But it wasn't his clothes or his manners that she questioned. It was his presence. "Let me get my manager," Isabel said abruptly, turning on her heel and disappearing through the staff entrance. Marcus exhaled slowly, glancing around the room. The restaurant was lively but far from full. He could see at least 4 empty tables from where he stood, one by the window, another tucked into a cozy corner. But experience told him not to point this out. Calling out their obvious dishonesty wouldn't help his case. Instead, he stood patiently, his hands resting loosely in his pockets. A few moments later, the manager appeared. an older man with neatly combed gray hair and a pinched expression that suggested he was constantly measuring his patience. His name tag gleamed. Philip. He approached with a forced air of politeness, the kind people adopt when they want to appear reasonable, but have already made up their minds. "Good evening," Philip said, his voice smooth but distant. "I understand there's been some confusion with your reservation." "Yes," Marcus replied evenly. "I made a reservation for tonight, Marcus Reed. It was confirmed when I called earlier." Philip gave a tight-lipped smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I see. Unfortunately, we seem to be fully booked tonight." His gaze flicked to Marcus's face briefly before sliding away, as if even eye contact was an effort. "These things happen, I'm afraid. Perhaps another evening would be more suitable." Marcus knew what was happening. He'd seen it too many times before. The way exclusion was dressed up in politeness, discrimination hidden beneath professionalism. They weren't outright refusing him service. They were just making it inconvenient enough that he would leave on his own. He could feel the weight of his emotions pressing against his calm exterior. Anger, frustration, sadness. He thought about all the times he had been underestimated, ignored, or pushed aside, even as his culinary talent skyrocketed him to the top of his field. But Marcus wasn't about to let this slide, not tonight. "I see," Marcus said quietly, holding Philip's gaze now. "I'll wait." Philip's expression faltered just for a second before he recovered. "I'm not sure that will be necessary," he began, but Marcus cut him off. "I'll wait," Marcus repeated, his voice firm but calm. Philip glanced around the room, perhaps hoping someone would step in and take over this uncomfortable situation. But no one did. Marcus stood his ground, his eyes unwavering, daring the manager to find a reason to make him leave. "Very well," Philip muttered after a moment, clearly uncomfortable. "But as I said, we are very busy this evening. It might be quite a wait." Marcus gave a small nod as if to say, "I've waited for things my entire life. What's one more night?" He stepped aside to let the manager and hostess return to their duties, finding a spot near the entrance where he could stand without being in anyone's way. The minutes dragged on, the hum of conversation and clinking dishes filling the space around him. A few diners cast curious glances his way, but Marcus ignored them. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him leave. In the quiet moments that followed, Marcus allowed his mind to drift. Memories resurfaced, his early days working in kitchens, struggling to be taken seriously. He thought of the countless hours spent perfecting recipes, the moments of doubt, the triumphs, the failures. He thought of every closed door he had ever faced and how he had fought to open each one, not with anger, but with skill and persistence. Marcus was not just any chef. He was one of the best. And tonight, whether they liked it or not, this restaurant would learn exactly who they had tried to turn away. Time dragged on. Marcus stood silently near the entrance, his posture relaxed, but his mind working overtime. The minutes felt heavy, each one stretching longer than the last. He had made up his mind. He wasn't going anywhere, no matter how long they made him wait. He shifted his gaze to the diners seated around the restaurant. Laughter echoed from one table, the faint clink of wine glasses from another. Servers moved gracefully through the room, carrying dishes plated to perfection. Out of the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed Isabel watching him from the host's podium, her expression tight with discomfort. It was clear she hadn't expected him to stay. Her gaze flickered to Philip, the manager, who paced nervously behind the bar, whispering to a waiter. They were hoping Marcus would leave. He smiled to himself. They had no idea who they were dealing with. A server hurried past him carrying a tray laden with appetizers, miniature tartlets and carefully arranged crostini. The aromas wafted toward Marcus, stirring a hunger he hadn't realized was so sharp. His thoughts drifted momentarily to the kitchen. He could picture it clearly, the hum of activity, the controlled chaos, the sound of knives chopping against cutting boards. For Marcus, kitchens were sacred spaces. They were where he thrived, where his passion came to life. He wasn't just a chef, he was a creator, an artist, a storyteller through food. But tonight, he was on the outside looking in. His patience was wearing thin when Philip reappeared. The manager's carefully constructed smile was back in place, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Reed," Philip said in the same detached tone, "we've reviewed our reservation list again, and I'm afraid your name doesn't seem to be on it." Marcus tilted his head slightly, the corners of his mouth curling into a knowing smile. He had expected this. They would rather deny reality than admit they had made a mistake, or worse, acknowledge their prejudice. "That's strange," Marcus replied, his voice calm and measured. "I confirmed it just earlier today." Philip offered a thin smile, as if indulging a child's complaint. "Perhaps there was a mix-up on your end. As I mentioned, we are fully booked. I do apologize for the inconvenience." Marcus felt the familiar sting of frustration rising in his chest. It wasn't the words themselves. They were polite enough. It was the tone, that thin, condescending layer beneath the words, a tone he'd heard countless times before in different forms. "You don't belong here." He could have left. It would have been easier, less exhausting. But every moment he stood there, refusing to leave, made it harder for them to dismiss him. That was the thing about dignity. It didn't demand attention, but it commanded respect. And Marcus was determined to be respected, even if they had to learn the hard way. He gave Philip a steady look. "You're sure the reservation isn't there?" Philip's mouth twitched. He wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially not by someone like Marcus. "I'm sure." Marcus smiled again, a quiet, deliberate smile. "Then if it's all right with you, I'll wait right here until a table opens up. I'm in no hurry." The manager blinked, caught off guard by Marcus's unflinching calm. Isabel glanced nervously between them, clearly uncomfortable. She shifted behind the podium, fidgeting with the edges of the reservation book, as if hoping it might somehow solve this awkward standoff. Philip cleared his throat. "I'm not sure when that might be, Mr. Reed. As I said, we are—" "I heard you," Marcus said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "I'll wait." Philip stared at Marcus for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether it was worth the trouble to keep arguing. Eventually, he gave a tight nod and stepped away. Isabel avoided Marcus's gaze as she busied herself with arranging menus at the podium, her discomfort palpable. The tension in the air was subtle but undeniable, like the quiet pressure before a storm. Marcus remained where he stood, perfectly still, perfectly composed. Inside, though, his mind raced. He thought back to the last time he had encountered this kind of resistance. It was at one of the first restaurants where he worked as a line cook. The head chef, a rigid, old-school Frenchman, had made it clear from the start that Marcus didn't belong in his kitchen. He refused to let Marcus handle anything beyond prep work, relegating him to washing vegetables and cutting herbs, no matter how perfect his knife skills were. But Marcus hadn't quit. He stayed late after every shift, practicing his plating techniques and experimenting with sauces long after everyone else had gone home. And eventually, when the chef had no choice but to taste one of Marcus's dishes, an impromptu sauce for a sea bass they were serving that night, everything changed. The chef never acknowledged the shift directly, but from that day on, Marcus was allowed to do more. It was never an open invitation, though. He had fought for every inch of progress. He was used to waiting. He knew how to wait. Marcus glanced toward the dining area again. From where he stood, he could see into the open kitchen. Flames danced beneath saucepans, and the sous chefs moved with precision, their faces serious with concentration. He could almost hear the sounds of sizzling butter, knives tapping against wood, the sharp clang of pans hitting stovetops. For Marcus, kitchens weren't just places to work. They were places where respect was earned, where passion mattered more than pedigree, a place where food spoke louder than words. And tonight, without knowing it, this restaurant had made the mistake of underestimating a man who understood that better than anyone. Just then, a couple of diners seated near the window turned in Marcus's direction. One of them, a woman with silver-streaked hair and bright eyes, nudged her companion and whispered something. Her gaze lingered on Marcus for a moment longer before a flicker of recognition crossed her face. She leaned closer to her companion, her eyes widening in realization. Marcus caught the moment, the subtle shift in the woman's expression. It was a look he had seen before: recognition, surprise, and, slowly but surely, admiration. The woman whispered something urgently to her companion, who turned to glance in Marcus's direction. Within seconds, the two of them were murmuring animatedly, casting quick glances toward him. Marcus didn't react. He stayed where he was, his hands still in his pockets, watching the room with quiet patience. The couple at the window exchanged a few more words, their excitement barely contained. Then the woman stood, smoothing her silk dress, and began walking toward the entrance where Marcus waited. Isabel noticed the movement and straightened, her nervous fidgeting momentarily forgotten. Philip, who had been pretending to polish glasses behind the bar, also looked up, his eyes narrowing in confusion. The woman approached Marcus with a warm, delighted smile. "Excuse me," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "Are you Marcus Reed?" "The chef?" Philip's expression froze. Isabel's mouth parted slightly in shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. Marcus gave the woman a polite nod. "I am." The woman's smile widened. "Oh my goodness," she breathed. "We've been to your restaurant. We love your work. I can't believe I'm meeting you here. What a surprise." Philip's face drained of color as the full weight of the situation hit him. He exchanged a panicked glance with Isabel, realizing, too late, exactly who they had just tried to turn away. Marcus watched the shift in the room's atmosphere with a quiet, measured gaze. Philip stood frozen behind the bar, disbelief washing over his features like a slow-moving wave. Isabel fumbled with the reservation book, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The woman who had recognized Marcus beamed with excitement, oblivious to the tension lingering between the staff and their now famous guest. "You must let us buy you a drink," the woman continued eagerly. "It's such an honor to meet you. My husband and I were just talking about that crab bisque you served last year. Absolutely divine." Her words stirred something inside Marcus, not pride exactly, but something quieter, a reminder of the path he had carved out for himself in an industry that was not built for people like him. The restaurant world had its gatekeepers. It was a world where talent wasn't always enough, where people who didn't fit the image of a renowned chef were dismissed before they had a chance to prove themselves. He had worked his way up through kitchens where few people looked like him, faced countless skeptics who doubted he belonged, and endured the kind of subtle, pervasive discrimination that made each success feel like a quiet rebellion. Tonight's encounter, though familiar, cut just as deeply. No matter how far he'd come, moments like this reminded him that the struggle wasn't over. Marcus glanced back at the woman, offering her a small, polite smile. "Thank you, ma'am," he said gently. "That's kind of you. But I think I'll pass for now." She nodded, still grinning. "Well, just know how much we admire your work. I'll let you enjoy your evening, if the staff here lets you, of course." She shot Philip a pointed look before returning to her table, her words hanging in the air like a well-timed jab. Philip cleared his throat awkwardly, wiping his hands on a towel that was already clean. "Mr. Reed, I must apologize for the mix-up earlier." His voice was tight, as though each word cost him a measure of his pride. "Had we realized—" Marcus held up a hand, cutting him off. "Don't, please." Philip's mouth snapped shut, and the silence that followed was thick with unease. Isabel kept her head down, her hands moving restlessly over the podium, as if arranging menus could somehow undo the damage already done. Marcus exhaled slowly, shifting his gaze to the dining room beyond. It was tempting, so tempting, to take the best seat in the house now that they were groveling. He could already picture the manager pulling out the chair for him, the server hovering nearby with the wine list, eager to make up for the insult they had delivered moments earlier. But Marcus knew better. Sitting down now, accepting their half-hearted apology, wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't undo the way they had judged him the second he walked through the door. And worse, it would feel like a concession, as though their approval was something he needed to earn. He had played that game before, working twice as hard, staying twice as late, hoping that sheer talent would be enough to dismantle the walls of prejudice around him. But the truth was, those walls didn't crumble just because you proved yourself. They stood firm, only shifting when you refused to let them define you. Marcus took a step forward, his voice steady but tinged with quiet resolve. "Tell me something, Philip," he said. "What was it about me that made you assume I didn't belong here?" Philip blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. I didn't mean—" "You did," Marcus interrupted, his tone unwavering. "You did mean it. You looked at me and made a decision before I even opened my mouth." Philip opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. There was no explanation that wouldn't sound hollow, no excuse that would erase what had already happened. "I've been here before," Marcus continued, his voice low but firm. "Not this restaurant, but places like it. I know exactly what it feels like to be turned away because someone like me doesn't fit the picture you have in your head." Philip shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Isabel, who kept her eyes glued to the menus in front of her, clearly hoping to disappear into them. Marcus let the silence linger for a moment, giving Philip time to sit with his discomfort. Then, with a sigh, he stepped back, the anger in his chest simmering but controlled. "You've got a lot of empty tables tonight," he said quietly. "I can see at least 4 from here, so don't tell me it was about being fully booked." Philip's face flushed a deep red, the truth laid bare in front of him. He knew he had no defense, and the weight of his mistake settled heavily on his shoulders. Marcus could have left right then. It would have been easy. Walk out, shake off the encounter, and chalk it up as just another reminder of how far the world still had to go. But something in him resisted the easy way out. He was tired of walking away. Tonight wasn't just about a seat at a table. It was about standing firm, about refusing to be invisible. He looked Philip in the eye. "I've spent my life proving people wrong," Marcus said quietly. "But tonight I'm not here to prove anything to you. I just came for dinner." Philip swallowed hard, nodding as if the gesture might somehow convey more than the inadequate words he couldn't find. A heavy silence fell between them. For a moment no one spoke. Then, slowly, Philip reached for the menus, offering one to Marcus with a stiff, awkward smile. "We'd be honored to serve you, Mr. Reed." Marcus didn't move. He could feel the weight of every decision pressing against him. The temptation to sit down, to accept the apology, to let the moment pass. But another part of him, deeper and quieter, told him that sitting down now would only mean one thing: acceptance. Not of the food, but of the insult that had preceded it. He shook his head. "I don't need a seat anymore." Philip blinked, confusion crossing his features. I don't understand." "You will," Marcus said simply, his voice soft but resolute. "One day you will." With that, Marcus turned, his steps measured and deliberate, and made his way toward the exit. The dining room buzzed softly behind him, conversations resuming as the tension in the room slowly began to lift. But Marcus didn't look back. He didn't need to, because tonight wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about knowing exactly who he was, and that was more than enough. Marcus pushed open the door and stepped into the cool night air. The noise from the street hummed around him, cars rushing by, the faint chatter of people on nearby sidewalks. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, feeling the familiar weight of disappointment settle into his chest. But before the door could fully close behind him, he heard hurried footsteps and the click of high heels against the tiled floor. "Mr. Reed, please wait." He turned to see Isabel standing at the doorway, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and desperation. She held the door open awkwardly, glancing back into the restaurant as if unsure whether she should stay or retreat. We didn't know," she stammered, her voice quieter now, almost apologetic. "If we'd realized who you were." Marcus looked at her, his expression calm but unreadable. "You didn't need to know who I was," he said quietly. "That's the problem." Isabel flinched slightly at his words, realizing how hollow her explanation sounded when spoken aloud. She fumbled for a response, but found none. The door behind her remained half open, and inside, Marcus could see Philip watching them from the bar, his face pale and tight with unease. Before Isabel could say anything else, the woman from earlier, the one who had recognized Marcus, appeared at the doorway again, this time with her husband trailing behind her. The excitement from before was gone, replaced by quiet concern. "Are they giving you trouble, Mr. Reed?" she asked, her eyes flicking toward Isabel. Her husband, a well-dressed man with silver-rimmed glasses, gave Philip a sharp glance through the open door. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. "Do you even know who you've just insulted?" Marcus offered them a small, tired smile. "It's all right," he said gently. "This kind of thing happens more often than you'd think." The woman's expression softened with sympathy, but her husband was less forgiving. "It's disgraceful," he snapped, his voice rising just enough to catch the attention of a few diners seated near the windows. "Places like this think they can treat people however they want, as if reputation is only skin deep." Philip, now visibly rattled, stepped forward, offering a nervous smile that failed to mask the panic in his eyes. "We meant no offense," he said quickly. "It was just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" The man in the silver-rimmed glasses let out a bitter laugh. "No, I think it was exactly what it looked like." Philip shifted uncomfortably, struggling to regain control of the situation. "Please, Mr. Reed," he said, his voice a bit more desperate now. "Allow us to make this right. We'll prepare a table for you immediately. No wait, no further inconvenience." Marcus stared at him for a moment, weighing the offer in his mind. He could feel the tension in the air, the restaurant staff waiting anxiously for his decision, the couple at his side eager to see some form of justice served. But sitting down now would feel hollow, like accepting an apology that only came after the damage was done. "You don't need to make anything right," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady but final. "You just need to do better." Philip's face twisted into something resembling regret, or perhaps just the fear of public humiliation, but he nodded stiffly, knowing he had lost whatever ground he thought he had. Isabel shifted awkwardly beside him, looking as though she wanted to melt into the floor. Marcus turned back toward the couple, offering them a gracious nod. "Thank you both," he said warmly. "But I think I've lost my appetite for the evening." The woman's face softened with understanding. "We're so sorry this happened to you, Mr. Reed. Please know that your work means so much to people like us." Marcus gave her a small, grateful smile. "That's good to hear," he said. "Thank you." With that, Marcus turned on his heel and began walking down the sidewalk, his steps measured and unhurried. He could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered conversation drifting behind him as he left the restaurant behind. He knew the story of what had just transpired would spread, maybe even make its way online by the end of the night. But that wasn't why he had stayed so calm. It wasn't about revenge or making a scene. It was about reminding himself and the people watching that dignity wasn't something others gave you. It was something you carried with you, no matter the circumstances. As he walked further from the restaurant, the streetlights above cast long, quiet shadows along the pavement. His mind drifted to other moments like this one, moments where his worth had been measured in fleeting glances and unfair assumptions. He thought back to the kitchen where it had all started, the tiny, hot kitchen of his first restaurant job, where the head chef had assigned him the most menial tasks, refusing to let him touch anything beyond the basics. Marcus remembered the long nights spent practicing alone, making dishes no one ever saw, just to prove to himself that he could do it. He thought of the times he had worked in prestigious kitchens, only to be overlooked for promotions given to less skilled chefs who looked the part. He remembered how, in those moments, it had taken every ounce of restraint not to lash out, not to let his anger consume him. Instead, he had let his cooking speak for him. And over time, the dishes he created became more than food. They became statements, acts of defiance, proof that he didn't need permission to belong. Tonight, though, was different. Tonight, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't in a kitchen, and there were no plates to send out, no dishes to perfect. All he had was his word, his presence, and that was enough. The street grew quieter as Marcus continued walking, the noise of the restaurant fading behind him. He could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, the occasional murmur of passers-by enjoying the cool evening air. He thought about where he might go next, maybe to a small diner tucked away on a quieter street where the food wasn't fancy but the service was warm. Or maybe home where he could cook something simple, something for himself. He let out a quiet breath, the frustration from earlier slowly ebbing away. The night hadn't gone the way he had planned, but that was all right. Not every battle had to end with fireworks. Some victories were quieter, small but meaningful shifts that set the stage for bigger changes down the road. Marcus glanced at the storefronts as he passed, catching his reflection in the darkened glass. He saw himself as he was, a man who had faced a lifetime of obstacles but refused to be defined by them. A chef whose success wasn't just measured in awards and accolades, but in the quiet, steady way he carried himself through moments like these. And that was enough. It had to be. As Marcus continued walking down the sidewalk, his mind still lingering on the interaction inside the restaurant, he heard the restaurant door swing open again behind him. This time, he didn't turn around. He expected it to be more awkward apologies from the staff, maybe another feeble attempt to save face. But instead, a voice called out. A voice filled with recognition and warmth. "Marcus, Marcus Reed!" He turned slowly to see a man striding toward him, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his expression a mixture of delight and disbelief. Tom Bradshaw. A fellow chef and old friend practically ran to catch up, his hand already extended in greeting. "Man, I can't believe this," Tom said, clasping Marcus's hand in both of his. "What are the chances? I heard you were back in town, but I didn't expect to run into you like this." He glanced back toward the restaurant door, raising a curious brow. "You were dining here?" Marcus gave him a small smile. "Tried to." Tom's brow furrowed as he glanced from Marcus to the entrance of La Riviere. His expression darkened slightly, as the realization dawned on him. "They turned you away, didn't they?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes told Tom everything. Tom let out a disbelieving laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Unreal," he muttered. "You've got to be kidding me. They really didn't know who you are." Marcus shrugged. "Why would they?" Tom shook his head, incredulous. "Man, Marcus Reed, the chef everyone is talking about, and they just showed you the door." He chuckled softly, though frustration simmered beneath his words. "They're going to regret this." Before Marcus could respond, Tom turned and marched back toward the restaurant, a mischievous grin creeping onto his face. "Wait here," he called over his shoulder. "This is going to be fun." Marcus sighed quietly, considering stopping Tom, but the door had already swung shut behind him. He leaned back against the wall, hands in his pockets, watching the evening traffic drift by. He wasn't sure what Tom had in mind, but a small part of him was curious. Inside, the tension in the restaurant had just begun to settle when Tom burst through the doors, his presence immediately attracting attention. Philip, still stationed awkwardly behind the bar, looked up in confusion as Tom strode toward him, exuding the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where he stood in the food world. "You must be Philip," Tom said loudly, his voice carrying across the room. "Let me introduce myself. I'm Tom Bradshaw. I own Diawa's Monarch, just a few blocks from here." Philip's expression flickered with faint recognition, though the name clearly made him uneasy. Monarch was a Michelin-starred restaurant, and Tom Bradshaw was known for his connections with the best chefs in the city. His sudden arrival wasn't a coincidence. It was a problem. "And," Tom continued, flashing Philip a wide grin, "I just had the pleasure of bumping into Marcus Reed outside your restaurant." Philip's face turned a shade paler, the name hitting him like a punch to the gut. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Tom leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. Do you know who Marcus Reed is, Philip? Or do you make it a habit to turn away world-famous chefs? Philip swallowed hard, scrambling to find words, but Tom didn't give him the chance. See, Marcus isn't just any chef, Tom said, loud enough for nearby diners to overhear. He's one of the most respected names in the business. People line up for weeks to get a table at his restaurant. He's been on more magazine covers than I can count, and Tom grinned wider. He's probably the best chef you'll ever have the chance to serve in this place. Philip's discomfort was now painfully evident. Isabel stood frozen behind the podium, her face a mixture of shock and regret. A murmur spread through the dining room as patrons began whispering among themselves, the pieces slowly falling into place. Tom clapped Philip on the shoulder, the gesture almost friendly if it weren't for the glint in his eye. And you, my friend, just told him there was no room for him. Philip's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But there was no recovering from this. The damage was done, and the murmurs from the other diners grew louder. A few people had pulled out their phones, whispering excitedly as they discreetly took photos. The story was already beginning to spread. The silver-haired woman from earlier leaned across her table, whispering urgently to her companion. "I knew I recognized him," she said. "Can you believe it? That's Marcus Reed, the Marcus Reed." Tom stepped back, folding his arms and watching Philip squirm under the weight of his own embarrassment. "So," Tom said casually, "what's the plan now, Philip? Still fully booked, or do you think you might find room for one more?" Philip fumbled for the words, his expression desperate. Of course we can seat Mr. Reed," he stammered. This was all just a misunderstanding." Tom gave a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Too late, man. Way too late." At that moment, the door swung open again, and Marcus stepped quietly back into the restaurant. The room fell into a hushed silence as every pair of eyes turned toward him, waiting to see what he would do next. Marcus scanned the room, taking in the awkward glances, the flushed faces, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. He could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. Everyone was watching, waiting for his reaction. Philip rushed forward, his hands wringing nervously. "Mr. Reed, please. Allow us to make things right. We'll have a table prepared for you immediately. No wait, no charge." Marcus held up a hand, silencing him with a calm, measured gaze. "No need," he said quietly. Philip blinked, stunned. "But no need," Marcus repeated. "You've already told me everything I needed to know." The weight of his words settled over the room, heavy and inescapable. Philip's shoulders slumped, his face etched with regret he couldn't quite articulate. Isabel lowered her gaze, as if unable to meet Marcus's eyes. Marcus glanced around the dining room once more, his gaze steady and calm. The murmurs continued in the background, but he paid them no mind. He had already made his decision, and it wasn't about a table anymore. He turned to Tom, offering a small, grateful smile. "Thanks for the assist, man," he said quietly. Tom grinned. "Anytime." With that, Marcus gave Philip one last look, a quiet, deliberate reminder that respect couldn't be earned through last-minute apologies. It had to come from the start, or not at all. He turned and walked toward the door, the soft murmur of conversations rising behind him. This time, as he stepped outside into the cool night air, he felt lighter, freer. Because tonight wasn't about sitting down at someone else's table. It was about knowing that he didn't need one to prove his worth. As Marcus walked away from the restaurant, his thoughts drifted to the past, back to the days when everything seemed like a fight for recognition. Success hadn't come easily for him. It was something he had earned through grit, passion, and sheer willpower. The memories came slowly at first, like flickers of old photographs. He saw himself as a boy, standing in his grandmother's kitchen, watching her stir a pot of gumbo that filled the house with warm, rich smells. She didn't follow recipes, just instinct and memory, her movements smooth and confident, as if the rhythm of cooking had been etched into her soul. "Cooking is love, Marcus," she had told him, It's how we take care of each other, how we show people they matter. Those words stayed with him long after she was gone. As a young man, Marcus knew he wanted to be a chef. Not just a good one, but one of the best. But he learned quickly that the world of high-end kitchens wasn't built for people like him. He remembered the first restaurant he worked at, an upscale bistro where every station was a battlefield, and the head chef ruled with an iron fist. Marcus had entered the kitchen with high hopes, eager to prove himself. But his enthusiasm had been met with cold indifference. "You're on prep duty," the chef told him on his first day, shoving a box of onions into his hands. "That's it. No cooking." At first, Marcus thought it was just part of the initiation. Everyone had to start somewhere. But as weeks turned into months, he realized that no matter how perfect his knife skills were, no matter how carefully he arranged the ingredients, the head chef never let him move beyond prep. The message was clear. He wasn't trusted with anything more. It wasn't just the lack of opportunity that stung. It was the way the other chefs looked at him. Some of them barely noticed he was there, treating him like part of the equipment rather than a colleague. Others made snide comments under their breath, subtle digs that cut deeper than outright insults. He remembered overhearing a conversation one night after service when the head chef thought Marcus had left the building. "Kid's got talent," the sous chef had said. "But you know how it is. Customers don't want to see someone like him running the kitchen." The head chef's response had been a low chuckle. "Exactly, he's good where he is." Marcus hadn't said anything at the time, but the words burned in his memory. They fueled him, pushing him to work harder, stay later, and learn faster than anyone else. Late at night, after the other chefs had gone home, Marcus stayed behind, experimenting with sauces and practicing plating techniques. He taught himself how to blend flavors in ways that weren't traditional, but still worked, combining the rich spices of his grandmother's cooking with the elegant precision of French cuisine. He started thinking about food not just as sustenance, but as a way to tell stories. Stories, his heritage, his journey. Eventually, his hard work paid off. He was given a chance to create a dish for the night's special, a sea bass with a citrus glaze and a hint of cayenne, served with a side of charred greens. The head chef had reluctantly agreed to let him try, expecting the worst. But when the first plate went out, something unexpected happened. A customer asked to meet the chef who had created the dish. Marcus remembered the way the head chef's face twisted in frustration as he was forced to introduce Marcus to the table. The diner, a wealthy patron with an eye for talent, had shaken Marcus's hand warmly, praising the flavors and asking when he would be opening a restaurant of his own. It was a small victory, but it marked a turning point. Word spread quickly about the new kid in the kitchen with a knack for bold flavors. Offers began to trickle in, first from smaller restaurants looking to bring fresh talent into their kitchens, and then from more established places, each promising him a chance to create without limits. But even with the growing recognition, the road wasn't smooth. At every step of his career, Marcus encountered resistance. Unspoken rules about what a chef should look like, subtle suggestions that maybe he should stick to soul food instead of trying to branch out into haute cuisine. There were nights when he questioned whether it was worth it, whether all the late hours and sacrifices would ever pay off. But every time doubt crept in, he thought of his grandmother's kitchen, the smell of gumbo simmering on the stove, and the warmth in her voice when she said, "Cooking is love." He decided that no matter how many doors were closed in his face, he would keep going. He wouldn't wait for anyone to give him permission to succeed. He would create his own opportunities. And so he did. Marcus opened his first restaurant at the age of 32, a small but elegant place tucked into a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't flashy, but it was authentic. Every dish on the menu a reflection of his journey. He called it rootsing, in honor of the traditions that shaped him and the new paths he was determined to carve. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, food critics were raving about the innovative fusion of Southern and French flavors. Diners lined up around the block, eager to experience the dishes that Marcus poured his heart into creating. By the time he was 35, Marcus had opened 2 more restaurants, each one more ambitious than the last. His name became synonymous with creativity and precision, and he earned a reputation as one of the most influential chefs of his generation. But even with all the success, he never forgot where he came from. His restaurants weren't just places to eat. They were places where everyone was welcome, no matter who they were or where they came from. And now, standing outside La Rivière, Marcus realized something important. His success had never been about proving the doubters wrong. It had been about proving something to himself, that he could take every rejection, every insult, every closed door, and turn it into something beautiful. As the memories faded, Marcus smiled to himself. Tonight's encounter at the restaurant had been just another reminder that the fight wasn't over. There would always be people like Philip and Isabel, people who judged others before they had a chance to show who they really were. But Marcus had learned long ago that their opinions didn't define him. He glanced back toward the restaurant one last time, the glow of its light spilling onto the sidewalk. Then he turned away, the cool night air wrapping around him like an old friend. Because tonight wasn't about winning a seat at someone else's table. It was about knowing that he didn't need one. He had built his own. Marcus walked slowly along the street, the cool night air soothing his thoughts. As the memories of his journey faded into the background, the weight of the night's events settled deeper into his chest. He hadn't set out to make a statement tonight. All he had wanted was a good meal, a quiet night to himself. But life had a way of reminding him, often in the most unexpected ways, that he was never entirely free from the assumptions others carried. He stopped at the corner of the block, the glow of La Rivière still visible behind him. The frustration from earlier simmered beneath his calm exterior. He could feel it gnawing at him, a familiar ache that urged him to turn back, demand more than just an apology. And yet, as tempting as it was to force a confrontation, Marcus knew better. His success had taught him one thing above all else. Dignity wasn't about winning battles. It was about knowing which fights mattered and which didn't. He exhaled slowly, glancing down the street at the glowing signs of other restaurants nearby. Places where the tables were open to anyone, where the staff greeted every guest with a smile. He could easily walk into any of them, sit down, and enjoy a meal without hassle. But that wasn't the point. This wasn't just about dinner. It was about principle. About making a choice not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been turned away, overlooked, or dismissed for not fitting into someone else's narrow idea of belonging. Marcus turned, his gaze drifting back toward La Rivière. He could see Philip through the window, pacing near the bar, clearly rattled by what had happened. Isabel stood at the hostess stand, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of her mistake had finally caught up with her. They were waiting for Marcus to come back, to sit down, to let them make it right, to accept their apology and, in doing so, absolve them of their mistake. But Marcus knew that accepting their apology wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't undo the initial insult. It wouldn't erase the moment when they saw him walk through the door and immediately decided he didn't belong. That was the thing about apologies. They could soothe, but they couldn't fix. The real change, the kind that mattered, only came when people understood the harm they had caused and chose to do better in the future. Marcus could have walked back inside. He could have sat at the best table in the house, ordered the most expensive meal on the menu, and let Philip and Isabel scramble to serve him with perfect smiles plastered on their faces. But it wouldn't have meant anything. It would have been hollow, a performance of hospitality, not a genuine change of heart. He knew the story of tonight's encounter would spread, whether he went back inside or not. People would talk. They would tell their friends how Marcus Reed, the celebrated chef, had been turned away from a restaurant too blind to recognize him. The story would become a warning, a reminder that assumptions and appearances were dangerous things. But that wasn't enough for Marcus. He didn't just want the story to be a cautionary tale. He wanted it to mean something, to leave a lasting mark, not just on La Rivière, but on every place like it. He wanted them to understand that every guest deserved respect, not just the famous ones. He stood on the corner for a moment longer, weighing his options. He thought about the younger version of himself, the kid chopping onions in the back of a kitchen, dreaming of a future where he wouldn't have to fight so hard to be seen. He thought about every aspiring chef who had ever looked up to him, hoping that his success meant the doors would open a little wider for them. This decision wasn't just about Marcus, it was about them too. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen for a moment, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. Then, with a small, deliberate smile, he opened his social media app and began to type. "Tonight, I was turned away from a restaurant because they didn't recognize me. It wasn't the first time something like this has happened, and it probably won't be the last. But it's a reminder of something important. Respect shouldn't be reserved for the people you think matter. It should be given to everyone, no exceptions." He paused, reading the words over carefully before hitting post. The message wasn't angry, it wasn't meant to be. It was a simple statement of truth, one that would ripple far beyond the confines of La Rivière. Almost immediately, the notifications began to flood in. Likes, shares, comments from people who understood, people who had experienced similar moments of exclusion, people who were tired of fighting to be seen. Marcus knew the post would spark conversations. Some would praise him for his restraint, while others would demand that he call out the restaurant by name, insist that he use his platform to tear them down. But Marcus had no interest in vengeance. This wasn't about punishing Philip or Isabel. It was about planting a seed, a quiet but powerful reminder that every interaction mattered, that the way people were treated in small moments said more about a place than the food on its menu or the awards on its walls. As the notifications continued to roll in, Marcus slid his phone back into his pocket. He felt lighter now, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He had made his decision, and it felt right. He turned away from La Rivière for the final time, his steps steady and unhurried as he walked down the street. The night stretched out ahead of him, full of possibilities. Maybe he'd find a cozy little diner and order a plate of pancakes, or maybe he'd go home, crack open a bottle of wine, and cook something simple, just for himself. Because at the end of the day, Marcus knew that he didn't need anyone's approval to know his worth. He didn't need a table at La Rivière or anyone's apology to feel complete. He had built a life for himself, a life filled with meaning, purpose, and joy. And that was more than enough. By the time Marcus returned home, the night air had cooled further, and the hum of the city was beginning to quiet. He stepped inside his apartment, kicking off his shoes with a quiet sigh. It was a small but comfortable space, filled with the things that mattered most to him: artwork from local painters, old cookbooks with well-worn pages, and a small collection of spices arranged meticulously on a shelf in the kitchen. This was where he felt most at peace, far from the expectations and pressures that came with his public image. He moved to the kitchen out of habit, pulling open the fridge and scanning its contents. His mind was still half occupied with the events of the night, but there was something grounding about the familiar rhythm of cooking. He reached for a few simple ingredients: eggs, bread, a block of sharp cheddar, and began assembling a grilled cheese sandwich, the hiss of butter in the pan filling the quiet apartment with warmth. As the sandwich sizzled, Marcus pulled out his phone and glanced at the screen. His social media post had taken on a life of its own. It was already being shared thousands of times, spreading far beyond his usual followers. Comments poured in, some supportive, some outraged, others sharing similar experiences. Had the same thing happened to me last week. Walked into a place and they looked at me like I didn't belong. They think they can treat us like this until they realize who we are. This is exactly why I don't bother going to these places anymore. I'm tired. Marcus scrolled through the responses, his expression thoughtful. He had known the post would spark conversation, but the sheer volume of it was overwhelming. People were angry, angrier than he had expected. And though he understood their frustration, Marcus didn't want the conversation to spiral into hatred. That wasn't what tonight had been about. Another notification popped up on his screen, an incoming message from Tom Bradshaw. "Man, you've started a firestorm," the message read. "Everyone's talking about it, even the food blogs are picking it up. La Rivière's gonna feel this one." Marcus let out a low breath, setting his phone down on the counter. He wasn't surprised that the story had spread so quickly. Controversy had a way of traveling fast, especially in the age of social media. But he also knew how quickly these moments could become distorted, how easy it was for outrage to drown out the more important lessons. He turned off the stove and plated his sandwich, carrying it over to the small dining table by the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and for a moment Marcus allowed himself to simply enjoy the quiet, each bite of the sandwich a reminder that food, at its best, was about comfort. As he ate, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from an unknown number. Marcus hesitated for a moment, considering letting it go to voicemail, but something urged him to answer. "Hello, Mr. Reed, this is Philip, the manager from La Riviere." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. He hadn't expected Philip to reach out personally, though he wasn't entirely surprised. "I just wanted to apologize again," Philip continued, his voice tight with discomfort. "I realize now how badly we mishandled the situation tonight. I'm truly sorry." There was a long pause on the line, as if Philip was waiting for Marcus to respond. But Marcus stayed silent, letting the weight of the moment linger. "I know an apology isn't enough," Philip went on, his words stumbling slightly. "And I know we can't undo what happened, but I just wanted to say," he hesitated, "we're going to do better. I promise you that." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, considering the sincerity in Philip's voice. It wasn't a perfect apology. It was awkward, uncomfortable, and clearly difficult for Philip to make. But it felt genuine, and that, Marcus knew, was a start. "Thank you for calling," Marcus said finally, his tone calm but measured. "I hope you mean what you say." "I do," Philip replied quickly. "We're going to make some changes. We have to." Marcus nodded, though Philip couldn't see it. "Good. That's what matters." Another pause stretched between them, this one slightly less heavy. "Take care, Mr. Reed," Philip said softly, and with that, the call ended. Marcus set the phone down on the table, his thoughts swirling. He knew better than to expect perfection from people, but he also knew that moments like this, moments of discomfort and accountability, were the first steps toward real change. He didn't need La Riviere to become the perfect restaurant overnight. All he needed was for them to recognize the harm they had caused, and to try to do better moving forward. He glanced out the window again, the quiet hum of the city wrapping around him like a familiar song. The night hadn't gone the way he had planned, but somehow that felt okay. Life was messy, unpredictable. It didn't always fit neatly into the narratives people tried to create. And that was all right. What mattered was that he had stayed true to himself. He had refused to shrink, refused to let the assumptions of others define him. And in doing so, he had planted a seed, one that might grow in ways he couldn't yet see. As he finished his sandwich, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The world wasn't perfect. It probably never would be. But there was beauty in the fight, in the quiet, steady way people pushed back against the things that tried to diminish them. And tonight, in his own small way, Marcus had added something to that fight. Not with anger, not with confrontation, but with dignity, with quiet, unshakable strength. He rinsed his plate in the sink, the sound of running water filling the small kitchen. As he cleaned up, his phone buzzed again, a new wave of notifications flooding in, the story still spreading, the conversation still growing. Marcus smiled to himself, a quiet, knowing smile. He didn't need to say anything more. The story would speak for itself. By the next morning, Marcus's phone buzzed nonstop. The simple post he had shared the night before had become a wildfire, spreading across social media platforms, news outlets, and food blogs. His story wasn't just being shared. It was becoming a symbol, a rallying cry for those who had experienced similar treatment in their own lives. The hashtags began trending within hours. Hashtag seen but not served. #respect for all. Messages poured in, some from strangers sharing their own experiences, others from well-known figures in the culinary world offering their support. Marcus sat at the small dining table in his kitchen, scrolling through the flood of comments. Some posts celebrated him for handling the situation with grace. Others expressed frustration, arguing that grace shouldn't have to be the answer to prejudice. "This happens way too often," one comment read. "The only difference here is they didn't know who Marcus was. What about the people who don't have fame to fall back on?" Another echoed the sentiment. "Tired of us having to smile through the disrespect. When are things going to change for real?" Marcus nodded quietly as he read the words. They echoed thoughts he had wrestled with many times before. He understood the anger, the frustration. It was a complicated line to walk, knowing that his fame gave him power, while also recognizing that not everyone had the same privilege. Then there were the news articles. Food blogs and culture websites picked up the story, turning it into an op-ed on racism in fine dining. One headline stood out: "When recognition comes too late, Marcus Reed reminds us that fame shouldn't be a requirement for respect." He skimmed the article, appreciating how the writer articulated the nuances of the situation. It wasn't just about Marcus. It was about an industry that had, for too long, measured worth by appearance and assumptions. The article highlighted similar cases from around the world. Customers denied entry to restaurants, job seekers dismissed before they had a chance to prove themselves. Chefs pushed aside because they didn't fit the image of who a chef was supposed to be. The media wasn't just reporting on what had happened at La Rivière. They were using it as a lens to examine deeper, systemic issues in the hospitality world. Marcus put his phone down, leaning back in his chair. He could feel the weight of the conversation pressing against him, heavier than he had anticipated. The story had taken on a life of its own, far beyond his control. And though he appreciated the support, he knew this was just the beginning. A text message popped up on his screen. It was from his publicist, Sharon. "Marcus, we need to talk," the message read. "The press is asking for statements. You've become the face of this thing and they're expecting you to respond." Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew Sharon was right. He had stepped into the spotlight, whether intentionally or not, and now people were looking to him for answers. He thought about the diners at La Rivière, about Philip's awkward apology over the phone. He didn't believe Philip was a bad person, just a product of a world that hadn't challenged him to think differently. And that, Marcus knew, was part of the problem. It wasn't about calling out individuals. It was about calling out the system that allowed these assumptions to exist in the first place. But how could he convey that without the message getting lost in the noise? He picked up his phone again, opening his messaging app. He typed a quick response to Sharon. "Let's talk soon. I want to handle this right." Then he switched over to his notes app, his fingers hovering over the screen as he thought carefully about what he wanted to say. After a moment, he began to type. "When I walked into La Rivière last night, I didn't expect to be treated any differently than anyone else. But the truth is, we shouldn't have to rely on fame or recognition to be treated with dignity. Every person, regardless of who they are or what they look like, deserves respect." He paused, thinking about the conversations unfolding online. It wasn't just about him. It was about the people who didn't have platforms, the ones whose stories went unnoticed. "This isn't just about me," he continued typing. "It's about all the times people are dismissed because of assumptions. It's about the invisible barriers we create when we judge people before knowing them. And it's about the importance of changing that, not just in restaurants but everywhere." He read the words over again, making sure they felt right. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that, he decided, was enough. Satisfied, Marcus set the phone down and leaned back, letting out a slow breath. He knew the response wouldn't solve everything. One post, one apology, one conversation wouldn't fix the deep-rooted biases that existed in the world. But it was a start. As he sat in the quiet of his apartment, the sun beginning to rise outside the window, Marcus felt a strange sense of clarity. The events of the night before had been frustrating, yes, but they had also been a reminder of how far he had come and how much further the world still needed to go. He thought about his restaurants, about the values he had built them on. Every guest mattered. Every person who walked through the door was treated with kindness and respect. It was a simple philosophy, but one that had shaped everything he did. He made a silent promise to himself, right then and there. He would continue to fight for that kind of world, not just in his own kitchens, but everywhere. Because change didn't happen all at once. It happened in moments like these, small, uncomfortable moments that forced people to confront their assumptions and choose to do better. His phone buzzed again, a new notification. This time it was a message from a young chef he had mentored years ago. "Thank you for standing up, chef. It means more than you know." Marcus smiled, his heart warm with quiet pride. The work was never easy, but it was always worth it. He stood from the table, stretching as the morning light poured through the windows. There was still so much to do, so many stories to tell, so many conversations to start. But for now, Marcus allowed himself a moment of peace, because in the end, the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the trending hashtags. It was in knowing that he had stayed true to himself and that he had inspired others to do the same. The days following the incident at La Rivière brought an unexpected wave of clarity for Marcus. The post he shared, though it was never meant to stir such widespread conversation, continued to resonate far beyond his circle of followers. Friends, industry colleagues, and even strangers had reached out to share their stories of being judged, excluded, or dismissed. Not just in restaurants, but in offices, schools, and everyday interactions. But Marcus knew that conversations alone weren't enough. Stories could shine a light on injustice, but change required more than awareness. It demanded action. And as the messages and news coverage kept pouring in, Marcus realized that he had an opportunity, not just to speak out, but to create something meaningful from the experience. He spent the next few mornings in deep thought, sketching ideas on scraps of paper, trying to figure out what form this next step should take. His restaurant group had always been about more than just food. From the beginning, Marcus had seen his kitchens as places where people from all walks of life were welcomed and valued, where the diversity of backgrounds was treated as a strength, not a burden. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. The solution wasn't just about calling out individual instances of prejudice. It was about changing the way the hospitality industry operated at its core. He picked up his phone and called his business partner, Evelyn, a sharp, no-nonsense restaurateur who had helped him launch his first restaurant years ago. "Marcus," Evelyn greeted, her voice warm. "Saw the news. I figured you'd be calling." "I've been thinking," Marcus said, getting straight to the point. "We've always talked about doing more, about finding a way to make our kitchens a model for what the industry should look like." Evelyn was silent for a moment on the other end of the line, and Marcus knew she was already piecing together where this conversation was headed. "You're thinking it's time," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "Yeah," Marcus replied, "I think it's time." They talked for over an hour, brainstorming ways to turn this moment into lasting change. By the end of the call, they had the framework for a new initiative, one that would go beyond their own restaurants. It would be a mentorship program known for young chefs, focused on providing opportunities for people from underrepresented backgrounds. But more than that, it would be about micro-educating restaurant owners and staff on the importance of hospitality as a value, not just as a service, but as a philosophy. "We'll set up workshops, training programs," Marcus said. "Not the kind of corporate stuff people forget in a week, but real, meaningful conversations. We'll teach people what it means to treat every guest, every employee, with respect, whether they're famous or not." Evelyn's laugh was full of pride. "I love it. This is what we've been building toward all along." Marcus smiled, a sense of purpose settling into him. For the first time in days, he felt like the pieces were falling into place. The incident at La Rivière had been a spark, an uncomfortable reminder of how much work still needed to be done. But it had also given Marcus the push he needed to turn those ideas into action. He could already see the path ahead: partnerships with culinary schools, collaborations with food organizations, workshops hosted in restaurants across the city. And slowly, one conversation at a time, the culture would begin to shift. But first, there was one more thing he needed to do. Later that afternoon, Marcus made a call to Philip, the manager at La Riviere. It wasn't an easy call to make, but Marcus believed in second chances. He believed that people could learn and grow if they were given the opportunity. Philip answered on the second ring, his voice hesitant but polite. "Mr. Reed." "Marcus is fine," he said, his tone calm. "I just wanted to check in." Philip seemed caught off guard by the call, and Marcus could almost hear the tension in his breath. I wasn't expecting to hear from you again." "I figured as much," Marcus replied. "I wanted to let you know that what happened the other night, it wasn't just about me. It's part of a larger problem in our industry. And if we're going to fix it, it's going to take all of us." Philip was silent for a moment, and Marcus gave him the space to sit with the words. "I've been thinking about that," Philip admitted quietly, "about how we operate, and you're right. We need to do better." "That's good to hear," Marcus said. "I'm starting a mentorship and training initiative. It's focused on creating real change in the way restaurants treat both their employees and their guests. If you're serious about making things right, I'd like La Riviere to be involved." Philip let out a breath, and Marcus could tell the offer had surprised him. But after a moment, his voice softened with gratitude. "I'd like that too. Thank you, Marcus." They spoke briefly about the next steps, and by the time Marcus ended the call, he felt lighter, as if the weight of the experience had finally begun to lift. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about ensuring that the next person who walked into a place like La Riviere wouldn't have to face the same assumptions. Later that evening, Marcus sat at his dining table once again, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He thought about his grandmother's words, how cooking was an expression of love and care. In many ways, this new initiative felt like an extension of that philosophy. It was about more than just food. It was about creating spaces where everyone felt seen, valued, and respected. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city skyline. Marcus poured himself a glass of wine and toasted quietly to the future. There was still so much work to be done, but he knew he was on the right path. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. In the days that followed, Marcus carefully laid out the foundation for his initiative. He knew the conversations sparked by his experience at La Riviere would only last so long. Social media's attention span was short, and outrage often gave way to the next trending topic. But Marcus wasn't interested in fleeting moments. He wanted sustained change. The program he and Evelyn had sketched out began to take shape. They decided to call it the Open Table Initiative, a name that symbolized both inclusivity and opportunity. It would offer free culinary mentorships, workshops, and internships to young chefs from marginalized communities. But equally important, it would host training sessions for restaurant owners and staff, focused on building a culture of hospitality rooted in respect and empathy. Marcus reached out to several of his peers, other chefs, restaurant owners, and food critics he trusted, and every conversation felt like a step in the right direction. Many were eager to support the initiative, expressing that they had witnessed or experienced similar issues in their own establishments. Within a week, Marcus posted another message on his social media platforms, this time announcing the launch of the Open Table Initiative. When we judge people based on appearances, we not only fail them, we fail ourselves. We limit what we can learn, experience, and share. The Open Table Initiative is our way of changing that. Together we can build a future where hospitality means more than just good service. It means creating spaces where everyone is valued. No exceptions. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. The same energy that had fueled outrage over his experience was now channeled into something constructive. Restaurants across the city began reaching out, eager to participate in the workshops. Local media outlets covered the initiative, amplifying its message. Culinary schools offered to collaborate, opening their doors to future chefs who had once been overlooked. And just as Marcus had hoped, La Riviere was one of the first restaurants to join. Philip reached out personally, pledging his full support. "We want to learn," he said earnestly. "We want to do better." Marcus accepted the gesture, not as a resolution to the past, but as a step toward the future. In a world that was quick to tear down, Marcus knew the importance of building something better in its place. He wrapped up his announcement with a simple but powerful question, aimed directly at his audience. "What kind of table are you building?" The night Marcus made his post, he stood by the window of his apartment, looking out at the city below. The lights twinkled against the dark sky, each one a reminder of how vast the world was, and how much work still needed to be done. He had started the evening wanting nothing more than a quiet meal at a restaurant. Instead, the night had taken him down a familiar road, one lined with the same obstacles he had faced throughout his career. But this time, he had done more than simply endure it. He had used the moment to create something lasting, something that could make a difference, not just for him, but for others. As he stood there, sipping his glass of wine, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight wasn't over. It never really would be. But he had done his part. He had stayed true to himself, held on to his dignity, and had transformed frustration into action. His phone buzzed once more, a final notification before the night came to an end. It was a message from a young culinary student he didn't know, someone who had seen his post about the Open Table initiative. "Thank you," the message read. "I didn't think there was space for someone like me in this industry, but now I think maybe there is." Marcus smiled, his heart full. The night hadn't gone as planned, but that was life. Messy, imperfect, beautiful. And in the end, it wasn't about the seat he had been denied. It was about the tables he would help build going forward. Because change didn't happen overnight. It happened little by little, conversation by conversation, table by table. And tonight, Marcus knew, was only the beginning. He raised his glass to the quiet night and whispered a toast to no one in particular, the words soft, but full of meaning. To open tables, to open hearts. Then, with a small, satisfied smile, Marcus finished his drink and let the night carry him forward. Marcus Reed's experience at La Riviere was more than a personal insult. It was a catalyst for change. Instead of anger, he responded with action, creating the Open Table initiative to promote respect and inclusion in the culinary world. His story reminds us that true success isn't just about recognition. It's about building spaces where everyone belongs and using moments of exclusion as opportunities to create lasting change. The tables we build define the world we leave behind. The night Marcus made his post, he stood by the window of his apartment, looking out at the city below. The lights twinkled against the dark sky, each one a reminder of how vast the world was, and how much work still needed to be done. He had started the evening wanting nothing more than a quiet meal at a restaurant. Instead, the night had taken him down a familiar road, one lined with the same obstacles he had faced throughout his career. But this time, he had done more than simply endure it. He had used the moment to create something lasting, something that could make a difference, not just for him, but for others. As he stood there, sipping his glass of wine, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight wasn't over. It never really would be. But he had done his part. He had stayed true to himself, held on to his dignity, and had transformed frustration into action. His phone buzzed once more, a final notification before the night came to an end. It was a message from a young culinary student he didn't know, someone who had seen his post about the Open Table initiative. "Thank you," the message read. "I didn't think there was space for someone like me in this industry, but now I think maybe there is." Marcus smiled, his heart full. The night hadn't gone as planned, but that was life. Messy, imperfect, beautiful. And in the end, it wasn't about the seat he had been denied. It was about the tables he would help build going forward. Because change didn't happen overnight. It happened little by little, conversation by conversation, table by table. And tonight, Marcus knew, was only the beginning. He raised his glass to the quiet night and whispered a toast to no one in particular, the words soft, but full of meaning. To open tables, to open hearts. Then, with a small, satisfied smile, Marcus finished his drink and let the night carry him forward. Marcus Reed's experience at La Riviere was more than a personal insult. It was a catalyst for change. Instead of anger, he responded with action, creating the Open Table initiative to promote respect and inclusion in the culinary world. His story reminds us that true success isn't just about recognition. It's about building spaces where everyone belongs and using moments of exclusion as opportunities to create lasting change. The tables we build define the world we leave behind.